Greeting and salutations. I am Lloyd, a producer at LCD Productions, and I have come to share this new series of visual audiobooks with you, the listener, the supporter, the viewer. Together we will go on a journey like never before, fly to new heights with Project Aerospace, explore new land and cityscapes with photations, even change the dimension of time through the power of time-lapse photography from live to tape. We'll even travel beyond the mind's eye into worlds captured and generated through animation from Thumbs United daily animation series. As we together go on these journeys filled with photography and theater of the mind, I hope you remember the core belief that we hold, that anyone can become the master of art, meaning that it is not some born skill what makes someone good at being creative. It is a desire to practice and spend time being creative that creates the master. I hope that these films, photography, and stories inspire you to set some time aside and practice some creativity. I believe if we all spend more time creating and being constructive, the world would be a better place, a more friendlier and fulfilling place. Thank you for coming. Let's begin this journey. Hello, this is Live to Tape. We are recording a new series, the Girl Aviators and the Phantom Airship. It's a little bit different how we're doing this. We're going to be creating this visual audiobook in partnership with Project Aerospace. And in the future, Live to Tape will be doing more partnerships with Photations, Project Aerospace, even Thumbs United. So we're going to have a lot more variety in our visual audiobooks, but story time will still continue with the time-lapse photography from a road trip across America, and the Flow series will also continue with steady cam footage from parks and architecture and cities and everything. So some things are changing, we're going to get a lot more, and some things are staying the same. So let's start the new book, The Girl Aviators and the Phantom Airship by Margaret Burnham. Chapter 1, The Golden Butterfly. Roy, where are you? Peggy Prescott came flying down the red brick path, a rustling newspaper clutched in her hand. Here I am, sis, what's up? The door of a long, low shed at the farther end of the old-fashioned garden opened as a clattering sound of hammering abruptly ceased. Roy Prescott, a wavy-haired, blue-eyed lad of 17 or thereabouts, stood in the portal. He looked very businesslike in his khaki trousers, blue shirt, and rolled-up sleeves. In his hand was a shiny hammer. Peggy, quite regardless of a big black smudge on her brother's face, threw her arms around his neck in one of her bear hugs, while Roy, boy-like, wriggled in her clasp as best he could. Now, just look here, cried Peggy, quite out of breath with her own vehemence. She flourished the paper under his nose and imitated the traditional voice of a town crier, announced, Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. Roy Prescott, or any of the ambitious aviators, now is your chance. Great news from the front. Third and last call. You've got auctioneering, the Supreme Court, and war times mixed up a bit, haven't you? Asked Roy with a masculine condescension, but gazed fondly at his vacacious sister nevertheless. Peggy made a little face and then thrust forth the paper for his examination. Read that, you unenthusiastic person, she demanded, and then tell me if you don't think that Mrs. Margaret Prescott has a good reason to feel somewhat more enthusiastic than comports with her usual dignity and well-known icy reserve. Ahem. Good gracious, exclaimed the boy as he scanned the news sheet. Why, this is just what we were wishing for, isn't it? It's our chance, if we can only grasp it and make good. We can, we will, exclaimed Peggy, striking an attitude and holding one hand above her glossy head. Read it out loud, Roy, so that Monsieur Bulot can hear it. Monsieur Bulot, a French bulldog who had dignifiedly followed Peggy's mad career down the path, gazed up appreciatively as Roy read out. Big chance for Sky Boys. Iron Master Higgins, the acting officer, $10,000 in prizes for flights and planes. $10,000, just think, cried Peggy, grasping her hands 1 minute and the next stooping to caress Mr. Belrot. "Oh, Roy, do you think we could?" "Could what? You indefinite person," impaired Roy, although his eyes were dancing as he knew well enough what his vacacious sister was driving at. "Could win that $10,000, of course, you goose." Roy laughed. "It's not all offered in a lump sum," he rejoined. "Listen, there is a first prize of $5,000 for the boy under 18 who makes the longest sustained flight in a plane of his own construction, with the exception of the engine, that is. And here's another $2,500 for the glider making the best and longest sustained flight, and another $1,500 to the boy flying the most carefully constructed machine and the one bearing the most ingenious device for perfecting the art of flying. Oh, listen, Peggy." I am," breathed Peggy with half-assumed breathlessness. "There's a prize offered for girls." "No." "Yes. Now you don't have to say any more that girls are downtrodden and neglected by the bright mind of the day. Here it is, all in black and white, a prize of a whole $1,000 to the young lady who makes a successful flight. There, what do you think of that?" "That, Mr. Higgins, is a mean old thing," pouted Peggy. $5,000 to the successful boy and only $1,000 to the successful girl? It's discrimination. That's what it is. Don't you read every day in the papers about girls and women making almost as good flights as the men? Didn't a Mademoiselle somebody or other make a flight around the bell tower at Bruges the other day? And hasn't Colonel Roosevelt's daughter been up in one? And isn't there a regular school for women flyers at Washington? And didn't the suffragettes promise to drop votes for women placards from the air upon the devoted heads of the British Parliament? You up-to-date person," finished Roy teasingly. Peggy made a dash at him, but the boy dodged into the shed, closely followed by his sister. But as she crossed the threshold, Peggy's wild scoop became a decorous stroll, so to speak. She paused, out of breath, beneath a spreading expanse of the yellow balloon silk, braced and stretched, with the brightly gleaming wires astray. One wing of the big monoplane upon which her brother had spent all his spare time for the past year, the fine thing almost completed now, stood in its shed, with its scarab-like wings outspread like a newly aligned yellow butterfly, which by stroke of ill luck had found itself installed in a gloomy cage instead of the bright open space of its native element. In one corner of the shed was a large crate surrounded by some smaller ones. The large one had been partially opened by Peggy, and gave a little squeal of delight as her eyes fell upon it. "Oh, Roy, that's it, rejoined the boy proudly, lifting a bit of the sacking from the contents of the open crate. "Isn't it a beauty?" The lifted covering had exposed a gleam of the bright scarlet enamel and a glint of the polished brass. To Roy, the contents of that crate was the splendid new motor for his airplane. But to Peggy just then it was something far different. A bit of mist dimmed her shining eyes for an instant. Her voice grew very sober. $3,000, oh, Roy, it scares me. Roy crossed the shed and threw an arm about his sister's neck. "Don't be frightened, sis," he breathed in an assuring tone. "It's going to be all right. Why, can't you see that the very first thing that happens is a chance to win $5,000? I know that, but the contest is not to come off for more than a month, and suppose someone should have a better machine than you." For an instant that air of absolute assurance, which truth to tell had made Roy some enemies, and which his greatest fault left him, his face clouded and he looked troubled, but it was as momentary as the cloud shadow that passed over a summer wheat field. "It will be all right, sis," he rejoined confidently, "and if it isn't, I can always sell out to Simon Harding. You know he said that his offer held good at any time." "I know that, Roy," rejoined Peggy seriously, "but we could never do that. We could never, neither of us, go against Father's wishes like that. Well, Roy, it's not to be thought of, poor Dad." Her bright eyes filled with tears as her mind traveled back to the scene of a year before, when Mr. Prescott had ceased from troubling with the affairs of this world, and condemned his children to the care of their maiden aunt, his sister, with whom, since their mother's death some years before, the little family had made their home. Poor Mr. Prescott had been a hopelessly impractical creature, an inventor. Fortunately for himself, however, he had a small fortune of his own, so that he had been enabled to carry on his dreaming and planning without embarrassing his family. Roy and Peggy had both been sent to good boarding schools, and had known, in fact, very little of the home life after their mother's death, which had occurred several years before, as already said. Mr. Prescott, in his dreamy, abstract way, had cared dearly for his children, but those other children of his, the offspring of his brain, that had surrounded him in his workshop, had somehow seemed always to mean more to him, and so the young Prescotts had grown up without the benefit of home influences. On Peggy's natural, sweet, vivacious character, this had not made so much difference, but Roy had developed, in spite of his real sterling worth and ability, into a headstrong, rather self-opinionated lad. His success at school in athletics and the studies which he cared about mugging had not tended to decrease these qualities. It had come as a shock to both of them a year before, when 2 telegrams had been dispatched, one to Peggy's school up in the Hudson and the other to Roy up in Connecticut, telling them to return to Long Island village of Sandy Bay at once. Their father was half shadowy bailing and very ill. The message had not exaggerated the seriousness of the situation. 3 days after his children reached the side of Mr. Prescott, gently breathing his last breath as he lived, so quietly that the end had come before they realized it. But in those brief moments Roy came to know his father better than ever before. He learned that the dream of his parent had been to produce an airplane free from the defects of its forerunner, a safe vehicle for passengers and freight. How far he had progressed in this there was no time for him to tell before the end came. But Roy, interested already in aeronautics at school, where he had been president of the High Flyers, a model airplane association, eagerly took up his father's desire that he would carry on his work and begin to take lessons in flying. In the shed which had been Mr. Prescott's workshop, the framework of an airplane had already stood, and with the aid of what money his father had left him, Roy carried on the work till now. It was almost completed, but the $3,000 which had gone for the motor had completely exhausted the lad's legacy. As Peggy put it, all their eggs were in an aerial basket. But how much Peggy had aided him in what had in the last few months possessed all his thoughts, Roy did not guess. To what extent her encouragement had spurred him on to surmount seemingly unconquerable difficulties, and how she had actually aided him in constructing the machine his ambition never realized. Not innately selfish, Roy was yet too used to having his own way to attribute his success to anyone but himself. Sometimes brave, loyal little Peggy, try as she might, could not disguise from herself, and it pained her a good deal, but she had uncomplainingly, ungrudgingly aided her brother without hoping for or expecting the appreciation she sometimes felt that she really was entitled to. But her great love for her brother kept Peggy from ever betraying to him or anyone else an iota of her inner feelings. So intent had the brother and sister been on their walk that neither of them had noticed while they conversed that a big 4-door touring car, aglitter with gleaming maroon paint, with a long low hood concealing a powerful engine, had glided up the white gate and a picket fence surrounding Miss Prescott's old-fashioned college. From a frank, pleasant-faced lad and an unusually striking girl, tall, slender, with a glossy mass of black hair coiled attractively on her shapely head, had aligned. Hearing the sound of the voices from the open door of the shed in which the Golden Butterfly, as Peggy had christened it, was nearing completion, they, without ceremony, at once made their way toward it. Peggy glanced up from her sad ravine as the sound of footsteps gave a glad little cry as she beheld the visitors standing framed in the sunlight of the open door. While she and the tall, dark-haired girl mingled their contrasting tresses in an exuberant schoolgirl caress, the lad and Roy were, boy-fashion, slapping one another on the back and shaking hands with just as much enthusiasm. Why, if it isn't simply delightful, Jess, you dear old thing, cried the delightful Peggy, as with both hands on her chum's shoulder, she held Jess Prescott off at arm's length, the better to scrutinize her handsome face, and Jimsy too, as she turned to the lad with a bright smile of welcome. Whenever did you two come from? The clouds, demanded Roy. No, hardly, although I don't bother at your asking such a question, laughed Jess, merrily exchanging greetings with Roy. Roy Prescott, positively I can see your wings sprouting. They all laughed heartily at this, while Jess ran on to explain that she and her brother were stopping for the summer at Seaview Tower, a summer estate which their father of Wall Street power had leased for the season. Of course, explained the merry girl, who had been Peggy's closest chum at school, her first thought had been to take a spin over in her new motor car and look up to her friends, for Roy and James or Jimsy Bancroft had been almost as close chums as the girls. And so this is the wonderful golden butterfly that you wrote to me about, exclaimed Jess enthusiastically after the first buzz of conversation subsided. Yes, this is it, said Roy, with a great satisfaction in his tone, and I'm proud of it, I can tell you. I think I've made a success of it. Jess and Jimsy exchanged glasses, and Jess stole a look at Peggy, but no cloud had crossed the face of Roy's sister. Oh, you darling, thought Jess, you're too sweet for anything. I just know how much you contributed to the golden butterfly's existence, and yet you won't detract a bit of Roy's self-satisfaction. As for Jimsy Bancroft, he said nothing. He glanced rather oddly at Roy for an instant, then his eyes turned to Peggy's face. Perhaps they dwelt there for rather a long period of time. At any rate, they were still fixed on her brave beauty when the sudden shadow fell across the stream of the sunlight that poured into the open portal of the workshop. So this is the place in which young geniuses find its habitation, granted out a rather harsh, unpleasant voice. They all looked up. Perhaps none of them, Jimsy least of all, was pleased to see the interruption. The newcomer was a tall, angular man with a withered, clean-shaven face, what Peggy called a money-making face, and surely that described Simon Harding, as he stood there in his black, none-too-new garments and his square-toed shoes. One could fairly catch the efficacious glint in his eye as he squinted rapidly over the new aeroplane's outline. By his side stood a youth who was so far as dress went, at any rate, the exact opposite of the elder man. Fanning Harding, or Fan as was usually called, was dressed in an elaborate motoring costume, his goggles of the latest and most exaggerated design were shoved up off his countenance now, exposing to a view good-looking brown face. It was marred, however, by the same restless, strained look that could be seen on his father's visage. We are not intruding, I hope, he hastened to say, coming forward with a cordiality that seemed somewhat forced. Not in the least, said Peggy, hastily realizing that none of them had perhaps looked very cordial. Won't you come in? Van Harding bestowed an admiring glance on her, seeming to be about to accept. His father, however, struck in. I'll leave you with the young folks, my boy, while I go up to the house. I have some business with Miss Prescott. As he shuffled off, Peggy and Roy exchanged somewhat uneasy glances. What business could this old man, in some respects a powerful financial and otherwise in Sandy Beach, have with their aunt? Say, Peggy, spoke up Van Harding suddenly, ain't you going to introduce me to your friends? And how about inviting us all to have some of those strawberry pop? And I noticed as we came down the path. Well, he isn't a bit backward about coming forward, like Jess, as the young people with due formality went through the ceremony of introductions. That was Chapter 1, and the next episode will be Chapter 2, Suspense and Achievement. Thank you for experiencing this journey we have created here at LCD Productions. For more information on how to support these films and projects, visit photations.com/support. Fine art photography prints from journeys around the world can be purchased from photationsstore.com, and digital downloads of our photography and visual audiobooks is available for personal use. Commercial use is available at a different rate. Thank you for your time. I hope to see you here again.